I'm going to do something I don't like this morning. I don't care for topical sermons. I vastly prefer sermons where you read and exegete a single passage, both to preach and to listen to. I think they're better for a whole host of reasons, not least of which is the very human tendency to say whatever you want to say is somewhat moderated if you're forced to make sense of a passage on its own terms. Jim actually provided a great example of this last week. That passage in John 6 is one that my Catholic and Calvinist friends are more comfortable with than I am, for just the reasons that Jim pointed out. But if you're forced to take the Bible as it comes to you, it always pushes back on the categories that you try to impose on it. And if we're going to pretend like we take the Bible seriously, we also have to let it make us uncomfortable. It takes some getting used to, but I've actually come to love the Bible for pushing past many of my inadequate categories, not just in spite of it. I also think the Bible is an incredibly rich story, and each book is intricately woven together like an enormous tapestry where every section tells a part of the same tale. And you need all of them together to tell the whole story. When you go through and cherry pick topics, it kind of feels like you're taking a knife and slicing out the bits that you like from the tapestry. You should never do that to a piece of art. So topical sermons offend my aesthetic sensibilities. They offend my sense of what good biblical interpretation does. And yet, as the time drew closer for me to give Jim some idea of what I'd be preaching about this week, after much prayer and soul searching, the only thing that I felt deep down that I had to talk about this week was covenant. You need to talk about covenant. So off we go. And because it's not in me to preach without first cracking open a Bible, I'm going to read two passages from the Old Testament to help us frame our discussion of the idea of covenant as it appears in the Bible. I'm going to start with a selection from Genesis chapter 15. So the Lord said to Avram, this is Avram before he became Abraham, "Bring me a heifer and a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." And Avram brought all of these to him and cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. And the birds he didn't cut in half, he just plopped them down. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, and Avram drove them away. And when the sun had set, darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord cut a covenant with Avram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates." And I'm going to skip a generation or two and read you from the end of Genesis chapter 31. This is after Jacob leaves. Laban is going back to the land of his forefathers. And Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. And yet, what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they've borne? Come now, let's cut a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar, and he said to his relatives, "Gather up some stones." And they took stones and piled them in a heap. And they ate there by the heap, and Laban called it the witness heap. And so did Jacob. And Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That's why it's also called the witness heap. It was also called watchtower, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters or take wives besides my daughters, even though no one's with us, remember, God is a witness between you and me." Laban also said to Jacob, "Here's a heap and a pillar that I've set up between you and me. And this heap is a witness, and a pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. And after they'd eaten, they spent the night there. Then early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. And he left, and he returned home. Now, I just picked 2 passages in Genesis to read, but covenant is a pretty widespread theme in the Bible. I did a little digging around this week, and I found out the word covenant shows up 320 times in the NASB translation. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is berit. In the New Testament, the Greek term is diatheke. As a fun aside, the word testament, as it refers to the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, is actually an archaic translation of the word berit. When we talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, what we're actually talking about is the Old Covenant and the New Covenant of the Bible. I thought that was kind of interesting. I was also surprised to learn the term covenant is spread surprisingly evenly throughout the whole Bible. It shows up a lot in Genesis, and it's not shocking that Exodus through Deuteronomy have a lot to say about covenant, since those books deal largely with God establishing a covenant with the people of Israel. But the majority of the occurrences of covenant show up in the rest of Scripture, with a lot more occurrences in the New Testament than I expected. In fact, covenant shows up about as often and as evenly as the word faith, and about twice as often as the word grace. Now, frequency is not necessarily a measure of significance, but if it is so prevalent that we're basically tripping over it everywhere we look in the Bible, I'm sure that means we have a really robust theology of covenants, right? I guess we'll find out. Incidentally, did you know how Old Testament refers to making a covenant, the actual act of making a covenant? So like if 2 people want to form a covenant between them, the Hebrew language doesn't say that they made a covenant. It would say they cut a covenant. Isn't that cool? We'll talk some more about why that is in a minute, but I just want to make sure we're all clear on the terminology, just in case I say that and you're like, what is he talking about? So, how many covenants are explicitly mentioned in the Bible? That one's not rhetorical. Huh? Well, that's how many times the word is used. But 2 covenants? 2 covenants? Do I have 5? Somebody said 12 over here. I'll tell you, I've actually published 2 scholarly works where the term covenant figures kind of importantly. And I actually would have gotten this wrong before this week. So the word shows up a lot, right? The word shows up 300 times. And there are lots of covenants that are discussed or alluded to. But in the Old and New Covenants of the Bible, we actually see 27 different covenants that get cut, where it explicitly refers to the making or the cutting of a new covenant. There are all kinds of relationships that could be reinforced by cutting a covenant. Most of them fell into one of 2 kinds: covenants between equals and covenants between unequals. You can think of covenants cut between unequals like an agreement between a king and his subjects. These weren't just an explanation of what's generally required of kings and subjects. They were voluntary agreements that go beyond normal expectations. Cutting this kind of covenant actually required a good deal of vulnerability on the part of the more powerful party. They were voluntarily choosing to set limits on their power and to make themselves subject to someone else's claims. On 6 different occasions, God cuts covenants with humans. I was going to make everybody come up with all 6 of them before I continued, but I don't think I'll do that. But those 6 covenants get reaffirmed another 5 times throughout the scriptures. And those 11 examples are probably the best known covenants in the Bible. They get talked about quite a lot. And they're obviously covenants between unequals, right? I don't think any of us consider ourselves to be God's equals. If not, come see me afterwards. So, 5 more times in the scriptures, humans cut covenants between unequals with other humans. These were, as I said, usually cut between a king and his subjects. But on 8 occasions in the Bible, humans cut covenants between social equals. Sometimes these were treaties or formal acknowledgments to a person's right to land or water. But often, they were simply a recognition of a desire to live peacefully with one another, even in the face of differences or competing allegiances. A great example of this is the covenant that Jonathan cut with David while Jonathan's father, King Saul, was seeking David's life. Cutting a covenant in the world of the Bible required 2 ceremonial elements. First, there had to be some kind of symbolic act that created a shared experience or physical reminder of the event, something you could remember later. In the oldest versions of the ceremony, like the one described in our first reading from Genesis 15, the 2 parties would dig a trench, a few inches deep and several feet long, and then they would cut multiple animals in half, letting their blood run down the trench between the 2 halves. And then the 2 parties would walk down the middle of the trench, full of blood, one after the other. It's not entirely certain what this ceremony symbolized. It may have been done as a warning against breaking the covenant, suggesting if you broke it, you'd end up like these 2 divided or like these several divided animals. Or it may have suggested that, like the animals lying on the ground, the 2 parties were 2 parts of an inseparable whole. They could only live while they stayed united, with the blood symbolizing their shared life. 2 people, 1 life. Perhaps both of these interpretations were part of the ceremony, a warning and an encouragement. But what isn't a question is that the people involved would have definitely remembered the experience. Man, let me tell you, I really considered trying to one-up Jim in the object lesson game this morning, bringing a few animals in here, giving a demonstration. I decided I'd like to keep preaching, but you would have remembered it. But that's where the phrase to cut a covenant actually comes from. That slicing of animals in half and walking through the blood. Even when later generations resorted to less bloody ways of commemorating the event, like Jacob and Laban did, the understanding was they were entering into the same kind of agreement. They were entering into the same kind of agreement. One with high stakes and an emphasis on a shared life. The other thing that a covenant ceremony required was food. I can get behind that. After the covenant was formalized, everyone would sit down to a big meal together and affirm their new familial ties. The one thing that humans do most consistently with the people who are most important to them is eat, except for maybe argue. But what is a covenant? Right? I can talk a lot about where covenant shows up in the Bible or how one gets enacted, but it still doesn't tell us what it means to live in a covenant relationship with somebody. As one scholar I consulted, Brenda Collin, points out, the Hebrew word berit covers an astonishing array of social arrangements, from marriage to treaties, from family pacts to constitutions. The covenants of the Old Covenant go to great lengths to preserve both contractual and relational natures of a covenant. The practice of cutting a covenant, which was common in the ancient Near East, generally signified the incorporation of outsiders into a family unit. The covenant shared many characteristics of a modern contractual agreement, with its stipulation of responsibilities and obligations and punishments for breaches. You're signing a contract, but unlike a contract, a covenant was always understood to be fundamentally relationship-oriented. I may sign a contract with my bank, but I don't really have much of a relationship with them. In many, if not most cases, covenants were invitations to or affirmations of kinship between parties. Another scholar, John Walton, notes that on any level of society, a promise to do something would be formalized by means of a berit. While our modern fascination with the divine covenants is understandable, given their theological significance, it's important for us to remember covenantal relationships were a common fact of life in the ancient world. For the historical people of God, entering into any agreement was an occasion for cutting a covenant. While there are several covenantal agreements in the Bible, they all shared three crucial characteristics, all 27 of them. First, they all lay out expectations and consequences of the agreement. In this way, they were very much like a modern-day contract. They stipulated who's to do what consequences would follow, and they had provisions for if somebody failed to be faithful to their covenant. Second, they all established either a new relationship or reaffirmed an existing one. Unlike today's contracts, the relationship was considered the central focus of a berit. In other words, contractual agreements served the relationship and not the other way around. And finally, they all involved a sacralization, a making sacred of the relationship. A covenant reminded all parties this agreement is more than a contract. It's more than a relationship. When you're dealing with a covenant, you're dealing with something that is holy. As an illustration, let's take that covenant cut between Jacob and Laban in the passage I read from Genesis 31. I mean, come on, I had to do some exegesis. Verses 49 and 52 lay out the expectations. Jacob is not to harm or abandon Laban's daughters, and neither party is to enter the other's territory with harmful intent. Laban wants to protect his daughters, plural, and his grandchildren, and ensure they wouldn't be sidelined by Jacob when he comes into a new land where taking new brides might bring a greater level of security and prestige. He didn't want them to be left behind. And Jacob secures the assurance of Laban that further claims to property or hostility won't be an issue, which is understandable given Laban's hostile tone in the preceding verses. But this covenant also had a relational intent. Verse 43 makes it abundantly clear that continuity and protection of his family is Laban's primary concern. He asks, what can I do about these daughters of mine and their children? The passage establishes a new basis for how Jacob and Laban relate to each other. They're no longer merely in-laws, nor are they employer-employee, which they had been previously. Now they're each one patriarchs of a large and important family. They face each other as equals in the world. Additionally, the passage ends with a feast, which in the Near Eastern context should be understood as a crucial part of cutting a covenant, the showing of hospitality. Then as now, our most important human relationships are built and maintained over shared meals. Finally, verses 49, 50, and 53 all invoke God as the guarantor of the covenant. The covenant's not only a contractual and relational thing, it is holy. To break faith with each other was to break faith with the Almighty. A covenant reminds all parties involved that they're entering a holy relationship, and it's not to be taken lightly. The solemn care and commitment that marked their sacred commitments needed to be extended to this relationship as well. This, of course, begs a question. How do you approach holy things in your life? What do you do with holy things? Imagine you had a small trinket in your house that was miraculously given to you directly from God. It's something he, kept with him in his heavenly throne room, and he's asked you to look after it for him. I imagine you'd take some measures to ensure its safety, right? Maybe. You wouldn't just put it in dangerous or compromising situations, right? You'd give it a place of honor in your house. Probably spare a few thoughts for it throughout the day. Take some time to care for and maintain it. But that's how you treat anything you treasure. Holy things aren't just any treasure. They don't just demand our care and attention. They require a certain kind of intention from us. You don't just waltz up to holy things. You approach them with awe and reverence. Those are attitudes that our society doesn't make much room for these days, and I don't think I'm very good at them, honestly speaking. I don't really know the last time I was awed by something or approached it reverentially. But if we're going to have a biblical understanding of covenant, we have to recapture our sense of what it means to call something holy. Because a covenant requires not only our careful attention to our responsibilities and the prioritization of relationship, it demands an attitude of reverence, a sense that we're participating in something that matters to God. So where do we still cut covenants today? We make a lot of contracts. I've signed more than I can count. But surely not every contract or written agreement we make constitutes a covenant. So where do we live in covenant today? You guys have any covenants in your life? Marriage? Yeah, marriage. I think marriage is probably the biggest, most important covenant for many of us. Any other ones? Church membership. Yeah, I think church membership is definitely a covenant that we enter into together. Relationship with Christ, absolutely. And Jesus points out participation in the Lord's Supper is partaking in the new covenant that he offers in his blood. Are there other ones? The fact that I can't think of any more kind of troubles me. What's that? Maybe? Yeah, I don't know. We do talk about that sometimes. Yeah, sometimes those are called covenants too, which is really interesting to me because they don't really seem to. It's a promise for sure. Yeah, I did. In the language, yeah, the legal term still pops up, covenant, but it doesn't seem to function theologically like a covenant. At least, when's the last time the bank had you over for a feast? Yeah, they'll find you. That's the first part, but there's two other parts that just kind of out there flapping in the wind. I think the fact that I struggle to come up with more concerns me a little bit because I just established covenants are not the sort of thing to be forgotten or neglected. As a faculty member for certain Christian institutions, I do sign a lifestyle covenant. But I think the point of all this today is to end by considering our covenant keeping. As we think about the covenantal relationships that we've entered into, I imagine most of us are pretty clear on expectations and responsibilities that those covenants lay on us. We may go through seasons where we're more or less aware of them, or better or worse at keeping them, But my guess is we all handle the contractual sides of our covenants comparatively well. But what about the rest of what it means to live in covenant faithfulness? Do we prioritize our relationships? Are we focused on living together in our marriages, in our churches, with other Christians, as family? When's the last time you thought about your marriage or your church family or whoever else you cut a covenant with as something sacred? And treated it differently? Do we surround ourselves with memorable experiences or physical mementos that remind us that we do indeed live in a covenant with others? Well, Jacob and Laban piled up a bunch of rocks. Seems kind of a weird thing to do, but you can see a bunch of rocks from a ways away. When you're walking toward each other, ready to go at it, there's the reminder you have to pass by. You can't act like that. I can think of a few times in our marriage, it'd be nice to have a reminder as you're getting ready to go to war. You can't act like that. These are all questions we have to answer if we're going to take the Bible's emphasis on covenant cutting seriously. Covenants are important. They're important to God. They're a foundational way God has chosen to relate to humanity. They bring with them many responsibilities and many rewards. They make and reinforce some of the most important relationships that we'll form and that will form us. And remind us that some of our relationships need to be attended the same way we approach other holy things. I want to close this morning just by telling you why I've been thinking lately about covenants. It actually started a few weeks ago, right over there, while I was talking with Pastor Jim after a service. We were noticing the fence posts that had recently started popping up along the property line here at Oasis. And I asked him if the property next door is still owned by the Coptic Orthodox congregation here in Lexington, or if it had been sold off to some developer who was going to cut it up for residential lots. And he wasn't sure. But he remembered the Coptic church had bought that property around the same time that Oasis bought this one. So we decided to figure out what was going on. To make a very long story short, shorter, I made contact with a fellow named Alex Eskander, a deacon in the Coptic Orthodox Church. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Coptic means Egyptian. And Coptic Church traces their spiritual lineage through the Alexandrian church fathers all the way back to the gospel writer Mark. It's a very ancient church and a tradition. Anyway, Mr. Eskander shared that the church that he's a part of is putting in the fence to aid them in their plans to develop the property. They are indeed still the owners, and they do still want to build a church there. But those plans are still waiting on the Lord's provision for them to begin building. They're a small congregation, small enough to make Oasis look big. In the meantime, their congregation's about to lose access to the place where they've been worshiping for many years. So they asked if Oasis would be willing to share our space while they're waiting to be able to build. I had that conversation about 3 hours before our next elder meeting, so I just brought the request up at January's meeting. And Jim noted that we're going to be neighbors for a long time, so we may as well start acting neighborly. So beginning in March, the Coptic Orthodox Church will be meeting here at Oasis. They'll have services every other Saturday, so it won't be on Sunday mornings. We're trying to avoid scheduling conflicts. And of course, there'll be times when that schedule needs to be adjusted. We're all willing to be flexible about things like that. So if, for example, you want to use the building on a Saturday morning, just try to let us know as early as you can so that we can deal with any scheduling conflicts. And if you walk in here on a Sunday morning and the place smells a little bit more incensey than it used to, that's probably why. Or maybe Jim's preaching on Psalm 141 and has something special planned. You never know. But as anyone who's ever had a college roommate or hosted family for the holidays can tell you, whenever people share space, there are usually points of friction. In this case, those are to be expected and as much as possible embraced. The reason I found myself thinking about covenants for the last few weeks is that as I was hammering out a written agreement to use between our two congregations, it occurred to me we can think of this arrangement as a contract or as a covenant. And I prefer the latter. It's very important to be upfront about the expectations and the requirements for hosting another church in our space. We want to make sure we're clear as possible about what everyone needs and making sure we meet those needs. But thinking of this new arrangement covenantally offers us opportunities beyond just our contractual obligations. We have a chance to welcome a new congregation who, like Oasis, has lived for years as a visitor in somebody else's church. We were sojourners once too. We had church in a box for about 20 years before we were blessed with this place to gather. Thinking covenantally invites us to embrace our currently wandering neighbors as family and to keep our interactions with them focused on building and preserving our relationship. It opens the door for us to live peaceably with our neighbors, to offer hospitality with generous and open hearts. And it reminds us the attitude that we have toward our neighbors, even in times of conflict, and there will be those, that attitude matters to God. And it ought to reflect our reverence for holy things. There's still logistics to be worked out. Most importantly, we need to find a good time to celebrate and share a meal. Things have come together in kind of a hurry, partly because our neighbors have been in kind of a time crunch. They need a space now. So if any of you have any questions or concerns, please find me after the service. I'd be happy to talk about those with you. But from our new friends, Father Pavlos and Mr. Iskander and their congregation, I've been asked to bring you greetings and an expression of their deep gratitude. I am hopeful that this new covenant that we're cutting will be a source of life and blessing and peace for both of our congregations.